Protests were carried out mainly by students and teenagers in universities who were frustrated after 3 years of the COVID pandemic. That's the response from Chinese President Xi Jinping to the unprecedented wave of protests that rocked major cities across China against the government's stringent zero-COVID policy. In a rare public outburst, thousands of people staged protests in various cities opposing the strictly followed zero-COVID policy, which is being followed in China since 2020 and which has now been intensified over the last few months. Protesters also called Xi, who was re-elected last month for an unprecedented third term, to step down. The slogans called on the ruling Communist Party of China to quit power. The protests in China have also fueled demonstrations around the world, reflecting the crisis and anger against Xi Jinping and his policies. So multiple questions have since surfaced. Do these protests punch a hole in Xi Jinping's credibility in his country? Is this the beginning of a turbulent era in China? That's the global debate. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Teena. Pleased to welcome on this edition of the Global Debate three distinguished experts. Professor Robert S. Ross, Department of Political Science, Boston College. Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, Center for East Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And Dr. Leo Roger, Associate Professor, International Studies, Flame University. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on the program today. To begin with, Dr. Roger, let's understand the nature and context of the protests. So protests in China on local causes specifically are said to be quite common, but not wider protests demanding for democracy and freedom of speech and expression. So how do you read the recent wave of unprecedented protests across major cities of China?
Thank you, Tina. Nice to meet you and all the panelists again. I think, well, to my surprise, this happens because in the first place, I didn't expect it. The Chinese, especially the younger generation, would devote themselves or even try this kind of, protests. Maybe a lot of them are at the micro level, but, well, if not handled well, will endanger their own lives and privileges. But what I think here is that the lockdown policy actually has driven a lot of young people to a very extreme situations where they lose almost all the incomes for the economy. They cannot get jobs. So their basic lives becomes a problem for them. And if you check the news, you can find that in different cities like Chengdu, like Beijing, a lot of young people, they're forced to be locked down in their flat, their apartments. They cannot get a job. They don't even have money to pay for their rents. So it becomes a problem. So that's why I think this kind of basic right-driven pressure, plus all the economic and political events being taken place for the recent times, actually, plus it all together, instigate the kind of incidents and the furies among the people, especially an event that is taking place in Qatar. The recent FIFA actually reminded the Chinese audiences that in the foreign countries, now they are not wearing masks. Well, they use this to compare with the situation that they are in, that the government have been telling them that because of the poor policies of the foreign countries, actually a lot of people have died. And situations were really bad in outside of a country. But now the youngsters, now they see the truth. They can compare that with what they are facing for now. So this kind of sporadic gatherings among especially the younger generations just started to spread across different campuses in different cities of China. So the basic demands, finally, some people just instigated the popular sentiments that, well, Xi Jinping has to be responsible for that. So somebody in the crowd just shouted out slogans like Xi Jinping step down and the CCP step down, asking the party to be responsible for that. So that's what we're seeing now. But so far, I would say that although this is the biggest the largest scale people's movement after the Tiananmen Square in 1989. But scale-wise, it's not comparable because if you remember, in 1989, the whole thing actually started at the end of April, at the beginning of April, and ends at the morning of June the 4th, 1989.
Okay.
So the mobilization process has been going for like 40 plus days. All right, and this Tiananmen Square movement actually attracts people of different walks of life and the social economic class to participate. You will see the citizens of Beijing, the college students of Beijing, the journalists of Beijing, the workers of Beijing, they all come together. So it becomes a very large scale social movement.
Okay,
but so far we have seen our sporadic ones taking place only among the college
Dr. Roger,
students.
since you drew a comparison between 1989 to the recent wave, let me bring in Professor Ross into the discussion, get his point of view. Professor Ross, the fact that not just Dr. Roger, but several other experts also see a lot of similarity between Tiananmen in 1989 to the recent wave of protests, not in terms of scale, but at least in terms of the outburst and the sentiment among people of China, because the protests have been spontaneous and they've been spread across various cities of China. If that is true, and if it indicates that kind of resistance against the government and its policies, what could it mean for President Xi Jinping?
Well, I think this is a clear challenge to Xi Jinping's authority, his respect within the Chinese leadership. Having said that, he is in such full control that no one dare challenge him. So there may be discussions between family members, but there is yet to develop any confidence below him to challenge his authority. Now, having said that, he clearly feels under challenge because this is clearly laid at his door. These things are happening because of his policies. So the question is how he will react to this clear embarrassment for himself and a potential source of weakness. And he could very well become far more controlling and far more repressive within the political system as he seeks to eliminate any potential rival, anyone who he sees as disloyal, because his fears of disloyalty are actually growing today compared to the past. Now, for how he deals with the demonstrators is a whole other issue. We do see at the local level some indication of loosening control, but he will never admit to having made a mistake. It will not be a formal reversal of policy. Rather, this will be a gradual process where he continues to repress and control these demonstrations, while gradually at the local level there could be some change. Simultaneously, we should remember that this is a country which is controlled by facial recognition technology. So even though there may be some changes at the local level, some easing of restrictions, those who dared to come out to protest, those who dared to call for the downfall of the Chinese Communist Party, those faces, that recognition will take place, and you can be sure they will be punished.
Okay, Professor Kondapalli, so, President Xi Jinping's authority may be unquestionable because of the kind of power that he wields. Just last month, he's been re-elected for another term. But all of the recent happenings, the wave of protests, the discontentment among the public, particularly the youngsters, does it, shake the credibility of Xi Jinping?
I think it questions the legitimacy.
That question is for Professor Kondapalli. Yes.
I think with the 20th Party Congress in October, there was the mention about 2 establishes and 2 safeguards, where Xi Jinping's thought, Xi Jinping as the core of the leadership, etc., been mentioned, which basically means that as it was mentioned in the 19th Party Congress before, the party leads everything. That is what they have mentioned at that point of time. Now the protesters calling for his resignation, although it may be an individual, a group of people, they do not have substantial backup in the sense of an organizational structure, the membership in the Communist Party or others. So it remains relatively less threatening to Xi Jinping per se in terms of his leadership. However, it means a loss of political legitimacy for Xi Jinping because he mentioned even in the 20th Party Congress about the dynamic zero COVID policy, which has led to all these troubles and all these protests in the first place. And most important thing is the last year's white paper on COVID mentioned about how the Communist Party has been able to openly, transparently, and efficiently tackle the COVID-19. Now, this stares into the protests and the number of infections, over 30,000 infections a day. That indicates that this policy has actually been problematic. And so the issue here is accountability. And that is where the criticism on Xi Jinping is increasing. So what could be the policy outcome? So as you know, the Vice Premier Sun Chunlan had announced a day before yesterday for relaxation of the drastic COVID-related pandemic control policies, number one. Before that, on November 20th, the National Health Commission had issued some 20 regulations. For example, you don't require now PCR tests. Now travel is relatively made easier. So it is quite possible, and I agree with Professor Ross, that there will be a gradualist approach rather than a radical approach in terms of removal of these COVID-19 kind of restrictions. And this is linked to the political legitimacy of the party. And hence, there is a lot of effort now will be made. One, of course, there will be repression on the students and others who participated. But because these are large in numbers, it would be also hard for the Communist Party to put everybody in jail or social credit systems being tweaked in the light of these protests. So I think there will be a lenient approach in the end, because this would lead to much more protests in the future. And so it is quite possible that they will adopt a lenient approach on the protesters. But I agree that there is the protesters were also making only minimalist demands. For example, public vigil. For example, the lifting of the zero COVID, kind of restrictions. They were also mentioning about the mourning or release of protesters or protecting civil rights of the protesters concerned. So these are very nominal, as the UN Human Rights Council had mentioned, and various other leaders have also mentioned across the globe. So it indicates that there is now a tension on how to gradually implement lifting of the lockdowns and other restrictions.
However, Professor, at the same time, there are also, steps, as Professor Ross suggested, there will be steps to plug the loopholes, the gaps that have found its way into the world as to how the videos of these protests have actually gone across, and there will be efforts to curb those in the times to come. But Professor Ross, taking on from what Professor Kondapalli said, accountability is in question, so there will not be a repressive measure, there will be a gradualist approach. But the fact that in a country like China, if there are repressive measures to begin with, could it also lead to a stronger civil resistance, something that we have seen in Iran as well? So stronger repressive measures could eventually lead to a much more out-of-control civil resistance. Do you agree?
Thank you. I actually disagree that there'll be a lenient response for the protesters. The foremost objective of the Chinese Communist Party is stability in the countryside, stability everywhere, and to prevent any kind of organization, any kind of protest that could challenge the authority of the Chinese Communist Party. We have seen under Xi Jinping a total crackdown since the Hu Jintao era of any independent demonstrations, any protests anywhere in the country. And he will take it upon himself to make sure that the Chinese Communist Party is never threatened. So he will do two things at once. He will take measures to ease the hostility of the people toward the party, as reflected in the control over society, the zero COVID policy, so on and so forth, while making sure that such protests that took place never happen again under his reign. He can do these two things at once. But yes, the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party is seriously in question right now, because the people believe that the interests of the party do not reflect the interests of the people. There's only one way that President Xi Jinping can rectify this situation, and that's to improve the economy. If he can turn this economy around, if he can restore considerable growth and economic growth, the people will say the party is doing a good job. They will not say that because there is accountability. They will not say that because it's representative. They will not say that because they believe that this party is out for the interests of the people. But if the party can raise the economic well-being of the people, they can forgive the other things. So there is great pressure on him right now to turn this COVID zero policy around, re-stimulate the economy, re-stimulate growth, so as to turn people's attention away from the COVID zero policy and to enjoy a higher standard of living with a growing economy.
Okay, so two different perspectives here, Dr. Roger, on what the Chinese President Xi Jinping's approach is going to be when it comes to dealing with the wave of protests and the fact that it has gone beyond just the zero COVID policy. How do you read his initial reactions? So today, while meeting, one of the leaders from the European Union, he actually dismissed it, saying it's because of the frustration caused over 3 years and that the protesters were largely students and teenagers. But isn't that also the bigger concern, that if the youngsters of your country are questioning your accountability, the credibility and your policies, your future is at stake? And how do you think Xi Jinping is going to respond to that eventually? Dr. Roger.
Yes, Teena. Well, I would like to agree with Dr. Ross about the future development and the Chinese government's policy towards that. Well, of course, just like you said, the young generation's furious sentiments need to be taken care of. However, I'm not so optimistic about everything because, well, just like Dr. Robert Ross has said, well, the Chinese society actually is under heavy control by the party state. So the party state is everywhere. So if they want to dictate what's happening in every corner of the society, they can do that, and they can nip everything in the bud. The second thing that we have to notice is that for any political movement to success, it has to have supports from the center of the party. Take a look at the example of Tiananmen Square incident in 1989. Actually, the things happen, escalated to such a big scale is because that the student movement and the people's movement got the support from the center. Zhao Ziyang, who is the party secretary, actually has a very sympathetic stance towards the students, and he has told Deng Xiaoping, who is at the helm of the military force of China, not to take in so stringent policy towards the students. So that's why this student movement lasts for like 2 months and more. But now we don't see this kind of thing happening in China. If you check the composition of PPSC, the newest composition of PPSC after the 20th Party's Congress, all the general secretary's men is over there. So there is no sympathizers at the center. There are no supporters from other, social echelons or any powerful political figures who can mobilize or make use of these populist sentiments against Xi. So nothing big will happen without this support from the center or some powerful figure. So I think what I would like to echo Rose that economic is very important. So if the party center, the party state can address these needs from the people to leash out some kind of economic revitalization process, and they can do it really well, and everything will go back to before.
Okay, Professor Kondapalli, what impact does it have on President Xi Jinping's image globally? The economy is not doing well. You've been battling COVID, so the world is opening up while China is not. And perhaps that has been the most basic reason and the foremost reason why there's been dissidence back home. And now, of course, his authority at stake because there is public anger questioning him and his policies. So how do you look at his image now globally? He's just begun his new term as president, and perhaps he could be president for lifetime. So overall, his image globally now. Professor Kondapalli.
Communist Party leaders are not concerned about their image, either domestically or externally. If you look at Mao Zedong, you look at Deng Xiaoping, Li Peng used to yell out at the human rights people in front of the White House and in front of the Brussels office. And likewise, Jiang Zemin, likewise every other leader. So I do not think the image actually counts here. Of course, you can say that there is a depletion in soft power of China with these incidents, the protest incidents, partly because the Chinese were trying to score points. And with the white paper last year, they were trying to say that look at these democracies, they were not able to really tackle the COVID-19. Look at the US, look at Italy, Spain, Portugal, France. People are dying without much medication or attention on this. Look at the second wave in India. The Communist Party of China and its organs have actually practiced vulture diplomacy by accusing democracies of not performing or not efficient, accountable. But now you have suddenly the surge in the Omicron cases, as well as the protests, widespread protests across. We have not seen across the globe against the leaderships in any of these countries where the virus has spread across. So this is actually a problematic for Xi Jinping to address because he had pitched the dynamic zero COVID policy as his personal legacy, yes, and also the lockdowns, etc., as the key policy inputs. Now that there is some relaxation that is promised in these COVID-related controls, now that there is a gradual phasing of policies expected, so it also indicates, as someone mentioned, he may not apologize, he may not do any one of those. Communist Party members don't do that. They have self-criticism sessions internally, but they have no public mentioning of any one of these. In fact, self-criticism campaigns were even initiated by Xi Jinping some 4 or 5 years ago in the Politburo meetings. So we do not expect them to publicly apologize for what has happened so far. But it is important to understand that the protests began spontaneously and spread across because of the excesses in the lockdown policies. There is, for example, border controls, quarantine procedures, very strict quarantine procedures. There is tracking through the apps on the mobile phones and others. There is also the economic problems. Very few people were given access to the markets and unemployment issue. There is nearly 18% unemployment in China today, which aggravates the street kind of protests. Previously, they used to mention this as mass incidents, but the premier of the state council began discontinuing giving such figures. So in reality, there are protests in China for a long time. Those are happening. In the current moment, these are all linked to the lockdown excesses and the COVID-related restrictions. So from that point of view, Xi Jinping does not have to tell the domestic audience or the external audience about the kind of image that he has now with these protests and the responses. But I would suggest that there would also be a mid-course correction because in the 19th Party Congress, 20th Party Congress, it was suggested that how can China sell its story to the people abroad? How can China model be exported? So from that point of view, the Chinese were suggesting that they need to influence the public opinion abroad. And this is where the problematic will begin. Right. For example, China Institutes for Contemporary International Relations mentioned that there is a huge negative fallout across the globe with the spread of the COVID-19.
Professor Ross, taking on from what Professor Kondapalli said, the fact that China wanted the world to hear out and listen to the China story, but at the same time, do the recent wave of protests also not bust the kind of narrative that China wanted to send across to the world, that every protest that happens in China is fostered by foreign forces, The fact that these protests have not just been spontaneous, but they've gone beyond the anger and sentiment against zero COVID. So there have been demands for democracy, which has been unprecedented. There have been demands for human rights violations and accountability from the government. There have been demands for freedom of more speech and expression. So do you see some sort of difference and the busting of that narrative that the Chinese government has sought to, reflect to the world all this while?
I think we need to differentiate who the audience is around the world. Within Africa, within Latin America, within Central Asia, even parts of South Asia, these events will have no impact on Chinese diplomacy, soft power, China's image. These countries, of course, not very many of them in much of the world are democracies. Many of them are repressive. And second, China's aid program is so important to these countries, they will prioritize this. On the other hand, there are certain targets of Chinese diplomacy that are very important, and these events will undermine Chinese diplomacy. This is particularly the case for Europe. The Chinese have worked very hard to try and undermine efforts by the United States to constrain European technology and economic cooperation with China. And China's human rights record, including Xinjiang, including Hong Kong, and now these recent demonstrations, are going to create considerable domestic public opinion pressure on the governments of Western Europe to indeed restrain their cooperation. And this will assist the United States in spreading its China policy toward Europe. And this is going to be a significant loss for China, I believe, because they will be less and less effective in influencing European foreign policy and promoting cooperation with European technology and economics.
All right. So, Professor Ross, thank you very much for your time. We understand you had a prior appointment and you have to leave. Thank you very much for joining us in the global debate and sharing your perspective with us and our viewers. Absolute pleasure to have you on the program. Dr. Roger, going forward, because we've discussed the kind of approach that President Xi Jinping may be, adopting in the times to come in terms of the crackdown, in terms of how he actually deals with such protests in future, but largely because he's just begun his new term and, he came up with such unprecedented powers, it was believed that he will have a much more aggressive approach when it comes to his policies with other countries, especially with adversaries. Now, do you see that domestic challenges will sort of curtail his authority to some extent in terms of also deciding China's foreign policy?
Well, I think it depends on how he is going to, how well he can control the whole situation. But well, as for now, I would think that the whole situation will be controllable because, well, I think it is possible. There's another possibility that the parties, they want to use this kind of incidents or a series of incidents to create a control pressure. By control pressure, I mean that the parties, they have been thinking about opening up China for a while. But since they have been talking about the importance of lockdowns and they have been doing the lockdown for the past 3 years, so they need a strong excuse to make this happen. They need a strong excuse to launch the new policies. So now they are letting the people's fury out for a while so that they can have this kind of, situation that help them to persuade those who oppose this kind of open up policy within the party. So they can now and after that, they can take the steps to gradually, unlock the Chinese society. In fact, now we have seen some cities like the southern city of Guangzhou, some areas has been unlocked, has been opened. So we have to see what will happen for the future. But just like you said, I think this kind of popular movement actually is an indicator that she has been growing more and more unpopular among the people because he has stayed in the position for 10 plus years. And nobody knows when we will see the end of the tunnel. So I think this actually it's a precursor of what will happen for the future is that when Xi is trying to do something new or trying to do something big, he will be facing more and more pressures from within.
But whether this unpopularity, Dr. Roger, whether this unpopularity and public anger is going to, mark a turbulent era in Chinese political landscape is something that only time will tell. But for now, I'll have to wind up the program. Thank you once again to you and Professor Kondapalli for joining us on this edition of the Global Debate and sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers. It's always a pleasure to hear you and have you on the program. Look forward to having you in our future episodes as well. Thank you very much for your time. And viewers, to you, thank you very much for your time as well. I'll see you same time next week with another topic and a different set of panelists. Until then, you take good care of yourselves. Keep watching Sansad TV.